Circularity is a motif that recurs in the Coen Brothers movies structurally in terms of how their stories are told, but it's also very much a visual motif. It starts with the ceiling fans in Blood Simple, which are sort of whirling above the characters while they're all in different locations, kind of lying in bed, looking up at them, suggesting this unity between them. And then those ceiling fans multiply quite humorously in Raising Arizona, at Nathan Arizona's shop, where 1 or 2 ceiling fans in Blood Simple suddenly becomes 30. And then moving forward from that, there's some pretty significant circular objects. There's the hat that blows through Miller's Crossing, the hula hoop in the Hudsucker Proxy is obviously a major one, the tumbleweed that introduces the Big Lebowski, and also the bowling balls in the Big Lebowski, the hubcap that becomes a flying saucer in The Man Who Wasn't There, even the engagement ring set at the end of Intolerable Cruelty, the quarter in No Country for Old Men.
Call it.
They just sort of keep building up and they keep recurring.
All right. Heads then.
Whether it's about looking for meaning in the films or whether it's just a design principle that the Coens enjoy.
Well done.
It just struck me that that was an interesting starting point and also was a way to get into aspects of recurrence and circularity in their movies, structurally and also thematically.
This is the best I can do. Call it.
The loop structure in the Coens, you see it at all points of their career. I mean, in Miller's Crossing, maybe it's more a matter of doubling than it is looping, but you seem to have the same scenes played either from different angles literally in terms of the placement of the camera, or different angles in terms of power dynamics within the story, or where characters are in their respective arcs. There are 2 meetings between Gabriel Byrne and John Turturro in Byrne's apartment, but the second meeting between them also directly mirrors an assassination attempt on Albert Finney's character's life earlier in the film. There are 2 sequences in Miller's Crossing. There are 2 sequences in which John Turturro pleads for his life from Gabriel Byrne.
Look in your heart. What hurt?
There's even 2 sets of love triangles. There's a heterosexual one in the foreground of the film and a homosexual love triangle in the background of the film.
What's going on between you and Bernie?
Nothing, Tom. We're just friends, you know, amigos.
You're a fickle boy, Mink.
The vertices of those 2 triangles kind of mirror and intersect each other. It's such a carefully written film, and then hovering above that you sort of have, you know, the hat as this organizing sort of principle and this central enigma, this idea of mystery that the Coens often have in their films as well. The Hudsucker Proxy really literalizes it in that it's a movie about a loop. It's a movie about the creation of the hula hoop, which then becomes this kind of stand-in for all kinds of other cycles. Cycle of innovation, the cycle of fads, cycle of capitalism, and even the score quotes O Fortuna, which is a piece about the circularity of fortune.
I had the boys down at R&D throw together this little prototype so that our discussion here can have some focus and give you gentlemen on the board a first-hand look.
The Hudsucker Proxy is a movie that literally begins where it ends. It starts with the main character, played by Tim Robbins, on a ledge. Even the narration speaks to a sort of cyclical thing. How did he get so high? Why is he feeling so low? And it will circle back to that scene at the end to fill in the backstory and the context of what's led him to this suicide attempt. But in inventing the hula hoop, he is in effect reinventing the wheel.
Congratulations, kid. You've outdone yourself. You've reinvented the wheel.
And not just sort of the cycle of the stock market, not just the cycle of industry and capitalism, but also sort of just cycles of human endeavor.
Hello?
Hello, Norval. This is the president.
Oh, my God, sir.
I just wanted to congratulate you. I'm very proud of you.
You also have these clock tower characters, these godly overseers who represent a dichotomy between good and evil and whose job it is to keep that circle moving.
Strictly speaking, I'm never supposed to do this. But have you got a better idea?
All the visual circles in the Hudsucker Proxy, whether it's the hula hoop itself or the clock face or the little halos that appear above the angelic characters who we see in the film, are mirrored in kind of just what it's about industrially, and also just cycles of film history and the different sort of periods and fashions looping back to an older mode of filmmaking and an older period of filmmaking and cycling it into the present tense. In The Big Lebowski, which superficially is this very shaggy dog, aimless film about a makeshift private detective who can't really detect anything, on the surface it's really loose and baggy, but it's so tightly constructed, both in terms of those doubling motifs I talked about with the two Lebowskis, the two Jeffrey Lebowskis, the big Lebowski and the proletarian washed out Lebowski. But also the film's very much about circles and circularity, that tumbleweed that drifts into town, bringing the genre of the Western into the genre of the California noir, also represents a kind of life cycle. And at the end of the film, the narrator, played by Sam Elliott, talks about that life cycle, talks about there being a little Lebowski on the way, an heir to the dude. And he suggests that this is how the human comedy perpetuates itself through the ages.
I guess that's the way the whole darned human comedy keeps perpetuating itself down through the generations. Westward the wagons, across the sands of time until we... Oh, look at me. I'm rambling again.
And this idea of perpetuation and continuity and paternity is very, very important to the Coens. Often the paternity in their movies is anxious or fearful, like in Raising Arizona. Here it provides them with like the closest thing I think they have to an unequivocally happy ending, the idea that there will be another little Lebowski. Inside Llewyn Davis is a loop that's really tied to the milieu of folk music. The character, this folk singer in Greenwich Village, he introduces a performance both at the beginning and the end of the film, because they are the same performance, by saying if it's not new and it never grows old, then it's a folk song.
So it's never new and it never gets old and it's a folk song.
And that speaks not just to the staunchness of this tradition, but to his kind of fixity and paralysis within it. He can't invent, he can't create, he can only interpret. And we're meant to sort of think both in terms of the loop structure of the movie and just his own inability to ever learn from mistakes, that he is a very trapped character. And in that way, it's a very claustrophobic film. It's a movie that keeps offering its character a way out, and he never seems to be able to take it.
No.
Or the film does not permit him to take it. So in this case, the loop is very much a closed one.
You a funny boy, huh?
What?
Hats open your big mouth, huh, funny boy?
There is a way of reading the film at the end that even if Llewyn can't get out of it, folk music can, in the person of Bob Dylan, who seems to represent a future. But it's a future that Llewyn Davis is not going to be part of. He's going to be in Greenwich Village forever. So in terms of circularity, I think that the Coens movies are very much about time, or about ideas of time. They keep making films that are set in the past, but whose characters are looking towards the future. And sometimes it's in a very comic way. At the end of Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, George Clooney's character talks about how we're looking forward to a veritable age of reason.
Yes, sir. A veritable age of reason, like the one they had in France. Not a moment too soon.
Or at the end of Fargo, the story is resolved, and yet Marge and her husband are in bed, and they have a very time-based moment of realization that her baby's going to be born in 2 more months.
2 more months.
Or even at the end of The Big Lebowski, the story is concluded, but the idea is that the little Lebowski's on its way. And I realized that as much as their films master the past, both the historical past and the cinematic past, through a really stylized, nostalgic recreation and representation, their films seem deeply, deeply anxious about the future. And if movies are set in the past that are anxious about the future, to some extent you can read them as being about our present tense. But I think they're also just always worried about the future and the uncertainty of what's coming. And Llewyn Davis's girlfriend, or semi-girlfriend, played by Carey Mulligan, asks him, why don't you think about the future? And he says, oh, do you mean flying cars and stuff? He can't possibly take the idea of a personal future seriously.
Do you ever think about the future at all?
The future? You mean like flying cars? Hotels on the moon?
In Hail Caesar, both the group of communist screenwriters who kidnapped the George Clooney character and the representative of the missile developer, Lockheed Martin, who make the ICBMs in the 1960s, they both tell Josh Brolin's character that they represent the future.
We are the future. What does that mean?
Beats me.
And that's a really interesting, to use a very Coen-y word, dialectic that plays out the idea of who has purchase on and who owns the future. And so while a lot of people tend to see the Coens as nostalgic, some people would even say politically they're reactionary, that they're yearning for a kind of past, I think that their views on the past are somewhat unsettled, and I think their view of the future is always unsettled, and that's where this obsession with continuity and lineage and paternity comes from. They always want in their movies to know that there's going to be a future and that things are going to continue. Their happiest endings are the ones that reassure us that it will. Their most frightening endings are the ones that suggest on an individual or a collective level it might not. Like the dream at the end of No Country for Old Men, which is as death-tinged a moment as I can think of in modern American cinema.
I knew that whenever I got there, he'd be there. Then I woke up.
Or the end of A Serious Man, which may just be a storm or may be the end of all things.